Better. This year, our distinguished lecturer is Joel Mokyr, and rather than introducing him myself, I've asked Rand Abramitsky, who before becoming a professor here at Stanford in the economics department, studied at Northwestern with Joel as his advisor. But before asking Rand to come on up, I do have like 3 announcements. First, I just want to remind everyone that we have a second and final lecture tomorrow, same time, same place. And you're all invited. After that lecture, we have a public reception, and everyone's welcome and encouraged to join us at that. And then final, just a note about the format, especially for the economists in the room. Joel will be speaking for 60 minutes, and then we'll have a Q&A, and he'll take his own questions. All right?
Thanks, guys.
Okay. Yeah. Rand.
So how do I introduce Joel Mokyr? Joel is one of those bigger-than-life characters, fluent in 6 languages, knows everything about everything, a true intellectual, one of the most important economic historians in the world, the world expert in economic history of technology, technological change, and the origins of modern economic growth. Although I did learn yesterday he had no idea who U2 was, so that, something's got to give, I guess. Joel is the Robert Strotz Professor of Arts and Sciences at Northwestern University. He's a professor of economics and a professor of history. He's a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and a former president of the Economic History Association. He has published 12 books and over 100 articles and made major progress on some of the most important questions in economic history, like what are the causes and consequences of the Industrial Revolution? Why did why did the West grow rich and the rest of the world didn't? Why did economic progress that once upon a time was the exception become the norm in the West over the last 200 years? Joel is also the #1 producer of economic historians. I counted that he has advised 55, he was the main advisor of 55 PhD students and was on the dissertation committee of dozens of others. And I was fortunate to be one of them. And maybe about 52 out of the 55, I had no intention to do economic history when I signed up to grad school. But all of them, by the end of my second year, there was nothing I wanted more than becoming an economic historian. So Joel's passion for economic history is contagious. He can make the fluctuations in the price of butter in the 14th century Liverpool sound like the most interesting topic in the world. He's also the most generous person you will meet. Although you do get the occasional email from him, kind of a formal email on a Northwestern letterhead, and you get it regardless of whether you are still in grad school or you are a professor somewhere, and it says, please update me about what you have been doing recently. And what progress have you recently made on Project X? And when you get that email, again, regardless of whether you're in grad school or a professor somewhere, you stop everything else you're doing and you answer that and kind of reflect on what it is that you've been working on recently. And this email became is kind of like a major, a well-known source of stress among generations of graduates. And so I guess today, before I ask you to join me in welcoming Joel, I will finally get to ask him the question on behalf of generations of graduate students. Joel, what have you been working on recently?
Well, better lift that down. All right, so what have I been doing recently? Well, I've been writing this book. This is the title, and it was formally accepted by Princeton University Press, so 2016 may be realistic, who knows. I still have to make some revisions. I'll show you the table of contents. Here's the table of contents. I'm not going to talk about all of this today, or else I've been in serious trouble. So I'm going to talk basically about a little bit about these 2 chapters and a little bit about these 2 chapters, and then tomorrow I'll talk a little bit more about chapter 16 and 17 and say a few more words about China. So let me try to take you through my plan for today. So I want to just lay out the main issues that the book addresses and maybe set out an outline of the set of concepts I use to attack these issues of cultural change that I think matter to the origins of the modern economy, and then try to explain is too pretentious a word, some critical elements of the emergence of a modern economy before the Industrial Revolution, and then go back to the old age issue that we thought we'd all beaten into the ground for generations, about European exceptionalism and how was Europe different in ways that really matter. And I'll come back to the comparison with China tomorrow. So here is what this book is about. It's about two issues that, at least when I started off, I thought they were quite different. The first has to do with the Enlightenment. So I've written two books, 2002, 2009, essentially making the argument that we economic historians had been guilty of sort of ignoring the 600-pound gorilla in the room of economic history, which is that the Industrial Revolution was preceded by the Enlightenment, and basically the Enlightenment took place, roughly speaking, in the same geographical areas as the Industrial Revolution, and so the likelihood that they would be related is at least plausible on the surface. And then I made a long argument about why, in fact, this Enlightenment was important. Not all of it, of course, some chunks of it. I call that the term I coined for this the Industrial Enlightenment, which is kind of a contradiction in terms if you think about it, but that's what I did. And so then, of course, the issue is, well, do you have a good explanation of why it is that Europe had an Enlightenment, at least the one that is relevant to subsequent economic growth, and nobody else did? And when I started off, I didn't know the answer, so I went ahead with it, and I'm going to try to suggest an answer today. So what is it that's important about what is this culture of the Industrial Enlightenment? Well, there are sort of a number of elements to it, which I'll just briefly lay out, although this is very, very summary. The first is what I call the Baconian program, which is essentially that the agenda of research in what they called at the time natural philosophy, which we would call basically, science and technology, should be geared toward practical purposes, and that they should be, have its aim to improve the material well-being of the state, of the nation, of the world, of whatever subset of humanity is in your objective function. A second part, which I won't talk about today, is that a great deal stood to be gained from creating connections between people who knew things, intellectuals if you want, and people who made things or produced things, artisans, and that kind of connection, those bridges as they call it, would be beneficial to the nation. And finally, and this too will be something I'll talk about more tomorrow than today, is a fundamental belief in progress. That's a human and social progress. Not only that it is virtuous and desirable, which is not, at least at the time, was not a self-evident proposition, but also it was possible. And moreover, that intellectuals were the ones to bring it about, which is a fairly strong statement. So without these cultural changes, I argued in those books, it's hard to see how long-term economic growth could have been triumphant in Europe. And the question is, where does it come from? Because little of this exists, say, in 1450 or even 1500. And basically, it's firmly entrenched in 1700, although it's not yet the peak of the Enlightenment, but certainly that's the period in which it's firmly off the ground. And so how can we explain that such a profound change? That's one issue that I'm interested in. The other issue seems to be unrelated, but I'll see how. And that's the sort of what I call the puzzle of institutions. And so it's no secret to anybody who's been reading in economic history, in fact, in economics in general, that in the last 20 years there has been, as historians would call it, an institutional turn. So following the seminal work of Douglas North, and then some people who followed him, particularly people like Avner, who's of course here, Danny Roderick, Darren Acemoglu, many other people, and the consensus has emerged. And the consensus may be too strong because there are some serious doubters, but roughly speaking, I think the majority of the profession has come to the conclusion that institutions really are central to explain economic performance. Now, what exactly is meant by institutions, how we define them, we could debate this, North has one set of definition, Avner has another. But basically, it's like, Justice Potter and pornography. We know it when we see it, right? So what are good institutions? Well, law and order, good property rights, effective third party or private order, contract enforcement, low levels of rent seeking and corruption, openness, inclusiveness, efficient governance, blah, 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 blah. All of those things are what we think of as good institutions. You got those, you've got it made. But the problem, of course, is, and this is a problem that has been pointed out by all people who are opposed to institutions, maybe no one more vocally than my friend Deirdre McCloskey, basically say, yeah, but that doesn't work for modern economic growth, because modern economic growth is all about technological progress. It's not just about more efficient markets, better allocations, and so on and so forth. Institutional changes just don't have the oomph, as you would call it, to explain the full extent of modern economic growth, which is a huge factor of improvement in every material aspect of human life. So if you want to use this terminology, before 1750, economic growth was based on these sort of better allocations, Smithian growth, if you want, which could really be supported by institutional changes, but not, or into an ever-decreasing amount after that. And so the question is, what kind of institutions, if you believe institutions are important, were instrumental in bringing about the rise in intellectual innovations that eventually led to the Industrial Revolution? So it turns out, after, and I just discovered this really fairly late in the game, that the answers to these questions converge, and that they both make us look at the intellectual history of the period 1500 and 1700, which this book is mostly about, under the motto, which I've long believed in, that intellectual history is too important to be left to the intellectual historians. And so I'm therefore going to talk about culture, but since culture is a famously vague and ambiguous and mushy subject, I'm going to actually narrow it down quite considerably so that at least you get some idea of the subset of all the possible definitions of culture that we can talk about, okay? So what I'm interested in is the part of culture that is about the physical world, the world around us, or what they called at the time in the 18th century, they referred to this as the useful arts, and I refer to it as useful knowledge. So that includes science broadly defined, but it has other things that we wouldn't define as scientific, as well as technology, and perhaps a set of sort of meta-beliefs about how and why to do research. So in that sense, it's very different from the recent work on culture, which is by Avner, by people like Guido Tabellini, which is primarily about the kind of culture that deals with relations between people and other people. So in that sense, we have expectations how others are going to respond to certain things that we do, and so on and so forth, and that leads to trust, it leads to possibilities of exchange. It's quite important. But for technology, I would argue, we are interested in what we call, the Talmud used to call, in relations between people and makom. So makom is a sort of weird term for God, but it's actually sort of the word literally means place. And it's really about sort of people and their physical environment. Now, the distinction here is tricky because it turns out, of course, as we all know, that science and technology are social processes in some way. But au fond, deep inside it, there is a thought about how do I relate to the physical world around us. And that, I think, is different. One other remark that's very important, and that's whose culture are we talking about here? And this is not popular culture. This is the culture of the intellectual elite, a small minority of educated, literati intellectuals, if you want to call them. And now you could argue that this is in some ways elitist, if you want, because I'm not interested in popular culture. I mean, I am, but not for this purpose. But I think it's probably an unassailable fact that science and technology are driven by a fairly small number of people, people we can make lists of. Zorina Khan, who is here, actually has produced these lists. I have produced these lists. Now, we all know these lists are incomplete, but it's a fairly, nobody would argue that this is more than a few percentage points of the population. There's a recent paper by Nico Voigtlander and Mara Squicciarini, which actually tries to measure this and quantify this and actually test the hypothesis that this sort of elite kind of mattered. I'm not going to talk about this now, but this is what we're talking about. We're talking about the attitudes toward nature of a small group of people. That turns out to be a small subset of what we're interested in culture, but one that's pivotal. And so how should we then think about this? And of course, for an economist, the obvious inclination is to think about markets and incentives, and that's what I'm going to talk about this here. But the question is this really applicable? And what I'd like to propose is that for the sort of first concept of today, it's not entirely a novel concept. There are others who have used this term, including people like Joshua Gowth and my former colleague Scott Stern, in a slightly different context. But this is sort of the concept of a market for ideas. And basically, the way I think about a market for ideas is, is a market for persuasion. I come up with a new idea, I've proven a theorem, or I've discovered the planet, or some cure for a disease, and I'm trying to persuade people of my new ideas. That is to say, there's buyers out there, some people who may read my papers or my books or listen to my lectures, and whether they accept these concepts, okay? And so when I make a sale, of course, I don't get paid, there's no money changing in, but what happens is there's a reputation effect, okay? So I get to be famous because I have discovered, a theorem or a star or, a law or, whatever, right? So we have this in economics, we have people who get famous because of the Solow model and the Arrow theorem and the Lucas critique, and, that kind of thing makes you famous. You're associated with an idea. So you get this kind of reputation effect. That's what the sale consists of. Now, of course, it's not a real market in the literal sense, but it's a useful metaphor, I think, because we can ask questions about how competitive it was, what kind of barriers to entry there were, what kind of transactions cost people paid, whether there were taboo things that couldn't be traded, and this I'll come back to this, and what kind of institutions were supporting this market for ideas and made it work. Now, that said, it's quite clear that if you think of a market, you think market failures. This is a market that's notoriously subject to market failures. And there's two sort of failures that are classes of failures that I think of. The first is very well known, and that is that the market for ideas, for new ideas, is chronically subject to underproduction because the well understood issues of appropriability and public good properties that if I produce knowledge, it's very hard for me to in any ways establish some kind of property that allows me to exclude others. There is a second issue which is not quite as well, I think, emphasized, but there is some work on this, and that is what I call negative incentives. And that is that if you come up with a new idea and you're actually successful in selling it, ipso facto, that acceptance may degrade the value of the human capital of people who held earlier ideas, or ideas that the existing orthodoxy, if you want. And that will, of course, give them an incentive to try to stop you by, and terms like heresy or apostasy or bid'ah in Arabic, every society has this kind of thing. And so these are negative incentives. There's a recent paper out by Andrea Vendini, who's here, and with my friend Roland Benabou and a third author, which deals with this and actually formalizes this and estimates it. So we have both a problem of weak positive incentives and strong negative incentives that work to make this market fail. And my argument is that basically that between 1500 and 1700, the educated elite in Europe developed a culture and a set of institutions that overcame, at least in large part, these incentive problems. Now, it wasn't perfect. In fact, it wasn't even very good. It was just better than what anybody else had. And that's all you need to essentially explain European exceptionalism, right? And so what they came up with is, in some sense, a set of cultural beliefs that came out of these markets for ideas that were friendly to the growth of useful knowledge and eventually to the science and technology that made modern economic growth possible. So before I go into the history of this, I want to give a little bit of the sort of the flavor of the formal framework that I am using for this. It's an adaptation. It's not something that I developed, but I think it's I find it kind of helpful, but I'm not sure anybody else will. So what kind of theories do we have to come to grips with issues like cultural change? And to my way of thinking, the most attractive ones come from evolutionary theory. Evolutionary models, and I've been doing these for decades now, and not all that successfully, I should say, but they have certain attractions in this context. One of them is that they are models of selection, that is to say, of choice, even so they are, not quite Darwinian kind of choices. But perhaps more important, because these are models that are fundamentally indeterminate. That is to say, they are contingent models. Things that happened didn't have to happen, and things that could have happened didn't happen. And a lot of social science isn't written that way, but evolutionary biology is, of course, and in that sense, I find them useful. And so the way then I think about this is essentially these are models about persuasion. So somebody comes up with a new idea and tries to persuade others and make a sale that way. And so the framework that I'm using is what's known as choice-based cultural evolution, in which socialization and learning and imitation and these processes of persuasion that I call are thought of as an adaptive process. And so new cultural, if you want, cultural species are introduced. So if you want, call them mutation. I don't like that, but some people do. Variants are introduced, and sometimes take over, sometimes they fail, sometimes they coexist with the existing story. But basically, that is what's happening. And so there's an interesting literature here that goes back to original book by Boyd and Richardson in 1985. This is essentially done by people who do sort of what I call formal anthropology. And for a long time, the economics profession behaved as if this literature didn't exist. I'm happy to say that more recently there has been some work together, and so I think this is in literature that we eventually will have to take notice of. But it's basically about the kind of issues that I talked about. And so, and that's, the analogy, and I don't want to drive this analogy too far, because you don't want really to shoehorn one sort of set of issues into the discipline of another. That's a bad move. But you could argue that from a evolutionary point of view, every person forms a unique cultural phenotype, if you want. But how is this formed? And it's essentially what you think of as sort of a Lamarckian process, because you acquire certain cultural characteristics. You learn things during your life, and you pass them on to others. So people choose. And so what makes the model evolutionary is the sort of standard things that makes every model evolutionary. It's inheritability. There's an intergenerational set of transmission of information. But of course, there's also information coming in horizontally and what they call obliquely. There are choices to be made in the sense there was variation in the past. And finally, and this is the trickiest part of it, and this is an essential part of every Darwinian model, is superfecundity. So in some sense, there are more ideas to choose from than anybody can accommodate. And so you have to make choices. It forces you to make choices. That's what makes, of course, superfecundity is, of course, what makes these models work in the first place. So among the few economists who have written about this, is a sort of a seminal paper by Bizin and Verdier, and so every individual is essentially socialized, and the default is that you're socialized by your parents. Okay, so if nothing else happens, you become a complete copy of your parents, but you're always influenced by others, and some of these others may be totally collinear with your parents. If they're picked by the parents, so that doesn't matter, but some of them are picked by the individual. So the default option is always to essentially become like your parent. And in the limiting case, which never obtains, is that if that everybody's exactly like their parents, and so all you get is sort of evolutionary drift, but you get no real interesting change here. But of course, that doesn't happen. People are presented with a menu provided by other people and sources that are other than their parents. Peers and push the wrong button here. Peers and media and I lost this thing. Never mind. And teachers, which may be less than fully collinear with the parents, and so these sources provide options, and individuals choose from these. And what I'm arguing is that is precisely the kind of process that we're looking at happening in the 1500 to 1700 period. So new ideas appear essentially on the menu, and people can choose between these, and the existing or new variants. And that's what's based, of course, sort of a choice-based cultural evolution. And in every society we have these sort of debates. Some ideas become totally fixed in the population, in that they fully drive out the competition, like the idea that the Earth is spherical rather than flat. I suppose the flat Earth society still exists, but for instance, theory like the theory of evolution has not become fixed in the population. Some people believe it, some people don't believe it, and so this all depends on what kind of rhetorical devices there are for accepting or rejecting a hypothesis. But some coexist with their competitors. In any case, these are then selected for by individuals who make these choices. And so how do people make choices in this market is, of course, tricky, and that's what much of this literature is about. Now, some people, I don't think there's a lot of them left, basically fall back on some kind of crude historical materialism. Basically say, look, choices are made that are consonant with people's economic interests. If you're an orthodox Marxist, you probably believe that. From that saying that economic interests don't matter at all, it's probably a long distance, but we're somewhere in between. People make these choices, and probably what's good for their pockets is not altogether irrelevant, nor is it, of course, true that people always make these choices based on their pockets. What is interesting, of course, that they make these choices very, very infrequently. Sometimes they, of course, make them. They never make them if they just continue to be like their parents. But you don't have people who sort of on a weekly basis decide whether they're going to be a Muslim or a Jew or a communist or a republic. I mean, these you can move from one to another, but it doesn't happen very often. So it's actually not so clear how people make these choices. And so what Boyd and Richardson have done is they've introduced this concept which they misleadingly refer to as biases. And I sort of talked with Boyd about it. He said, yeah, we've picked the wrong term, but now that it's stuck, we can't really get rid of it. So I'm using it, but it's very different from what anybody else, certainly in economics, would think of as a bias. But there's a whole list of these biases, and I'm just going to give you a brief list. I'm not going to go through all of them because then I won't get to the history. But you can sort of see about how these things work. So the most obvious thing is what we call content bias. Basically, somebody persuades you on the basis of evidence or logic that, yes, this is so, and what you've previously believed isn't so. And so you reject what you previously believed, and now you believe something else, okay? Probably far more common is what I call direct bias, which is you don't actually check the proof, but somebody tells you this is so. So some authority tells you, so this is obviously to cut in information, because not everybody can believe or check the proofs. I mean, when Newton's Principia came out, there were maybe 100 people in the world who could, maybe, that's an upper bound estimate, who could understand the math, but they were really good people. And so everybody said, oh, well, I can understand it, but so-and-so tells me, Christian Huygens tells me this is good stuff, and he's a good mathematician, so we believe this. And so authority counts for a lot. Then there are people who just, blindly imitate people, which they call model-based bias. So, you do because the Duke or the Queen, believes something, so you're going to believe it too because these are people you want to imitate. There's, of course, frequency-dependent bias. You do what the majority people do around you. That, too, is a cost-saving information device. When in Rome, behave like the Romans. If that was all that was going on, actually, the model would cease to be interesting because you'd get, everybody eventually converging to the same thing. But thank God, there are always people for whom frequency-dependent bias is negative. So they look what everybody else is doing, and they do the other way around. Most of these are my colleagues. Then there's what we call rhetorical bias. People look at not so much at the content, but at the framing, or the propaganda, if you want, things like that. I could go on about this. I'm kind of interested particularly in what I call salient event bias, because that's the one I made up, and that's not in Boyd and Richardson. But I think it's actually not completely crazy, and that is that when something really dramatic happens that shakes your previous belief, you may revise what you thought you knew and switch to something else. So people often cite the Black Death as a good example. We can think of the Holocaust. We can think of 9/11. These are sort of salient events that change people's minds and which may cause people to move from one set of beliefs to another on particular topics. So these biases all exist, and and they will play some kind of role. And I spend a lot of time in the book talking about that. And clearly the way these biases operated over time themselves is changes. In that sense, there's obviously some kind of meta process by which the way these biases work change. So the entire concept of content bias changes over time. What is proof? How do you convince people that something is right, and how do you persuade people? Or if you think about direct biases, who are the really authorities? How are they chosen? How are they appointed? Who appoints the appointers? I mean, these are all issues that are clearly changing over time and historically contingent, and I would argue that they changed a great deal in this period. So, just as one example of these salient events, I think one of the big salient events that made people change their mind were what the Europeans called the great discoveries, of course, the great voyages, if you want to talk about it. But basically, this opened people's eyes that the world wasn't quite the way they had been told. And so once you start questioning these things, you start questioning many other things, and lots of the old knowledge fell by the wayside. So here is a short list, a very, very short list of the huge number of changes that established themselves between 1500 and 1700. And anybody who's taken a high school course in the period of this history of this period would recognize them. Okay, so Protestantism, heliocentrism, iatrochemical medicine, Cartesian dualism, blood circulation of the blood, Galileo, on and on and on. So these are all changes. None of these, I would argue, existed in 1500. All of them are part and parcel of the cultural scene in 1700. Many of them push out, of course, existing knowledge. Most important for me is the cultural variant which I refer to as the Enlightenment, which becomes a winner in this period. And so, as I said, and I'm repeating myself here, this is the belief in the possibility and desirability of human progress, barely noticeable in 1500, very much part and parcel of the human beliefs of the intelligentsia in 1700. This notion about Baconian useful knowledge, which I already mentioned. And finally, and I haven't mentioned this yet, but this is also something that's quite important, and this has to do, of course, with the concept of direct bias. This is the willingness of Europeans to abandon the belief in the superiority of the canon, and so their willingness to sort of loss of respect, if you want, for the classical canon, and that's something I'll talk about more tomorrow. But there's a whole bunch of other things that win out in the market for ideas between 1500 and 1700. The value of experimental philosophy, the importance of mathematics and quantification, the possibility of making progress just by collecting a large amount of facts and data, organizing them, classifying them, and then looking for empirical regularities. This is sometimes crudely associated with Bacon's inductive methods. In fact, it's not quite, but clearly this becomes something that people increasingly do at this period. And finally, and I have a long chapter about this, but I'm not going to go there today, and that is that scientific research and the natural investigation of natural philosophy is a virtuous thing to do. It's moral, it's ethical. That's, of course, associated with the sort of Puritan movement and the famous Merton thesis. It's actually slightly more complicated than that, but roughly speaking, I think by 1700 it is no longer considered to be in any shape or form a bad thing to investigate nature, and in fact it's not considered to be contradictory to religion, so nobody gets persecuted for being engaging in black magic and things like that. So what I would argue, and I'm going to come to the crux of the matter in a few minutes, between 1500 and 1700, the market for ideas in Europe changes dramatically. It becomes much more competitive. It creates better incentives to produce intellectual innovations. More and more people can enter, lower entry barriers, lower transaction cost, fewer topics that were taboo. Certainly by the end of the period, we are getting sort of free-thinking radicals like, say, John Toland or Spinoza, if you want, who actually, questioning, the ultimate heresy, questioning, the nature of God, and of course, this sort of Baconian shift to subject matter. And so, Just one short digression before I get to the sort of punchline. So I would argue that the market for idea becomes much more effective in this period, but how do I know this? How do you measure this? And so I have sort of two ways, both of them sort of coming from economic history, that guide me in this direction. The first is that in good markets, entrepreneurs get a better chance of being successful. Okay, so the great age of entrepreneurship in American history is the sort of gilded age between, say, the Civil War and World War I. That's the age in which we were probably as close to a laissez-faire economy, at least for most of the period, than we ever were. And it's also the age in which great entrepreneurs emerged. Many of them have universities named after them, so I don't need to list them here. And I think this is a period in which the market for ideas seems to flourish better, simply because there are a large number of what I call cultural entrepreneurs, incredibly influential people who change the way many others think about this. Okay, so I have two chapters in the book about two sort of examples that I picked. One is Francis Bacon, the other is Isaac Newton, but one could make the list endlessly longer and talk about Galileo, talk about Leibniz, talk about Spinoza, Copernicus. I mean, these are all people who stand out as intellectual entrepreneurs in the sense that they changed the thinking of a large number of other people. The other thing is tricky, and I just want to I spent quite a bit of time on this in the book, but I can't do this afternoon. But in a good market, we know that basically what we should observe is a law on one price. So if there's low transactions cost and every good information, okay, then we should see the price of a particular good to be more or less the same everywhere. We shouldn't see a lot of spread. Now, what I think is happening in this period is that when it is possible to make knowledge sufficiently tight, that is to say sufficiently easy to prove, then eventually it becomes widely accepted, despite the fact that there's a lot of interest geared up against it. So heliocentricity is perhaps the best example. So it took a long time to catch on, but certainly in the 17th century, the proof for it accumulated. And even people who didn't like a universe in which the Earth was not in the middle of it, basically said, yeah, without the evidence, it's sort of overwhelming. The same is true, mutatis mutandis, for the sort of role of the heart in the circulation of the blood, which William Harvey showed in a rather sort of, I would say, graphic manner by, slaughtering dogs in front of audience and watching the blood spurt out. I mean, but it worked. And so maybe the best example of this is the proof of an atmosphere, which was one of the more important discoveries. So it's a lot hard to prove people that there's an atmosphere because you build a barometer, which is what Torricelli did, and basically then you have people running up and down mountains like Pascal's brother-in-law famously did, and Pascal said, well, go upstairs and measure it. He was too lazy to do it himself. And basically, and I say, as I go up, the pressure is coming down. That is persuasive. And so eventually, very few people ended up doubting that. The same was true mutatis for other things like Newton's laws and so on and so forth. So these things essentially these are cases when the evidence is sufficient, which is a big if. Then good knowledge will drive up bad knowledge. What I mean by good knowledge, not necessarily correct. It didn't have to be correct. It just had to be consistent with the rhetorical criteria of the time. Okay, so now I'm coming to this central story of this. So how do these markets succeed? And what we learned from Doug and from Avner and from others is that for markets to work effectively, they need some kind of institutional foundation that specifies and enforces the rules and the culture by which this market produces its regularities, or as Avner would call it. And this is hard because they have to design an institution that overcomes the public good properties of knowledge and finds a solution to this sort of commons problem. I don't deal with the knowledge problem as sort of in terms of Elinor Ostrom and her work on commons, but you could see it that way. I mean, this shares many features with it. And so this institution, which I will reveal to you in a minute, basically is the one that solves these two sets of incentive problems. And as I said, incentives were of two kinds. It increased positive incentives, it reduced negative incentives, and against all odds, between 1500 and 1700, Europe produced the institutions that did all that. And now it's important to realize that Europe is not the only place that has to have a market for ideas. China has a market for ideas. But what Europe is the first to do is to stumble, and I use this word as consideration, because it isn't a design, it isn't something that somebody planned, it sort of came about, emergent property if you want. It stumbled upon an institutional solution that supported the market for ideas, that actually encourages intellectual innovation, and that eventually led to an exponential growth of useful knowledge, which eventually became the Industrial Revolution and everything that followed it. And so that's the institution. It's called the Republic of Letters. It's an early virtual community. So within Europe, this sort of commons resource, if I may call it that way, was increasingly after 1500 organized through this sort of transnational community of scholars, which referred to itself as the Respublica Literaria. And the group included essentially everybody who was part of the European educated elite, so the crème de la crème of European societies, scientists, well, they didn't call themselves scientists, the term hadn't been invented yet, but they were natural philosophers, physicians, other kind of philosophers, mathematicians, and of course all kind of people what we would think of today, perhaps unthinkingly, as sort of fake scientists, but at the time were certainly regarded as equally important intellectuals. Occultist writers, mystical writers, astrologers, alchemists, people like that. And this is a group that, despite the differences, shares certain characteristics. Maybe a relatively homogeneous is too strong a term. But they were, of course, educated. They all, or certainly until 1700, all spoke and wrote Latin. They were religious, most of them, but certainly open-minded enough to engage people who had other religious beliefs. And they subscribed to this sort of common ideology of the Republic of Letters. So what was this Republic of Letters exactly? Well, it's a network. It's an international network of European scholars that shares and distributes new ideas and findings. The earliest mention that anybody knows of the term is in 1417, but it's widely agreed that the sort of person who got it off the ground was, or one of the people who got it off the ground was Erasmus of Rotterdam, and lived in the basically contemporary of Martin Luther, and that it reaches its peak in maybe the Age of Enlightenment, although I would argue that in some ways it's still with us. It's important to realize, and I've already said this, it wasn't designed at all to do what it was doing. So it's a classic emergent property. It's a complex phenomenon that results from very simple interactions, but which add up to something much bigger than itself. What is, I think, beyond doubt, is that this is uniquely European. No other civilization ever came up with anything close, and for good reasons. And so it is not a construct of historians, unlike the Middle Ages, which is, of course, an invention. Nobody in the Middle Ages knew she was living in the Middle Ages. But the Republic of Letters is not invented. This is a quote from Pierre Bayle, a French Huguenot who lived in exile in Rotterdam, and in 1684 published actually a newsletter called Nouvelles de la République des Lettres. And he describes what this Republic of Letters is all about. It's a state, he says. The analogy to having a political entity is not something that we invented. They actually thought about it in those terms. It's a state extremely free. The empire of truth and reason is only acknowledged in it. Everybody's being sovereign and under everybody's jurisdiction, and blah, 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 blah. So this is, needless to say, to some extent self-serving. Okay, these guys are not above that. But it is clearly something that they thought about. Here's another quote. If you've heard of this person, you're very well read indeed. This is a very obscure French writer, Noël Bonaventure d'Argonne, but this is a nice quote. He says, the Republic of Letters embraced the whole world. Of course, the whole world is sort of France and the areas around it. He's French after all. And it's composed of all nationalities, all social classes, all ages, and both sexes. The latter statement is demonstrably false. All languages, ancient and modern, are spoken. The arts are joined to letters, and artisans have their place in it. Nah. But this is how these people talk about it. So, and finally, of course, I cannot refrain by quoting the great man himself. During the age of Louis XIV, before that, the Republic of Letters was established almost unnoticed despite all the wars, and blah, blah, blah. So this is Voltaire in his famous book, The Age of Louis XIV, in which he describes this is late in the game when this thing has been around, of course, for a long time, and this is obviously somebody looking backward rather than forward. But it's kind of nice, I think, typical Voltaire kind of statement. It's one of the great consolations for the evils that ambition and politics have spread through the earth. There's some truth to this. Okay? So what it is then, it is the institution, the community in which this knowledge was shared, distributed, and evaluated. And therefore, it is the knowledge in which, and there's a classic paper by Paul David, who couldn't be here today, but he points out, I think very correctly, that this is the institution in which open science emerged. A slightly different way of looking at it, but also, give me a Stanford connection, is through a sort of a famous paper by Mark Granovetter, in which we can look at this as sort of what he called a weak ties network. And this is kind of interesting. The members of the Republic of Letters didn't know each other very well, or not at all. Many of them had corresponded and been in contact in some way, but never met each other. They still didn't go to conferences the way we do. And so what that actually means is because they don't know each other, as Granovetter points out, levels of trust are relatively low. And in some ways that's good, because that means if you have an idea, you better back it up or nobody's going to take you seriously. So people were really, it's not just come up with this sort of grand idea, come up with the evidence. And of course, if in a weak ties network, information tends to be less redundant because people don't sort of communicate on a daily basis. So actually, new ideas spread quite quickly. So why does Europe have this Republic of Letters? And so for that, there's some fairly prosaic, almost banal reasons. The main mode of communication of the age was correspondence, that is to say, epistolary networks. Also, they also, of course, published, and books were important factors. And what made that possible is an improvement in postal service. Now, the history of postal service in the world is not the most popular part of economic history, but it is something which we know something, and the improvement in postal services was associated with the Habsburg Empire, in particular a family of Italians associated with somebody called Francisco de Tasso, later Germanized to Franz von Taxis. And he and his brothers basically established a sort of system of regular postal services within the domains of Emperor Charles V, which of course encompassed a large chunk of Europe. There were other areas, other parts of Europe that also needed these correspondence, banking houses, and increasingly multinational religious orders. And so these people all needed to correspond, and basically this is what this thing was based on. In France, a few years later, essentially Henry IV issues a decree that royal couriers are allowed to carry private mail, and so France jumps on this bandwagon as well. So fairly safe to say that in the 16th century, or a little bit after, Europe gets a postal services that is probably not bad, maybe not all that worse than United States Postal Service today. But what this is a virtual community. These members of the Republic of Letters rarely met, except of course the ones that were organized in things like the Royal Society, but certainly on an international level they rarely met, and when they do, this is actually a big event. So actually somebody wrote a book about a single meeting between Leibniz and Spinoza that took place a few years before Spinoza died, and this is sort of a big deal. And the whole book's just about that meeting because it was fairly uncommon. What is also interesting, of course, however, that like any network, you have nodal points, and they were known at the time as intelligencers. And these were essentially figures who, when they received a letter that they thought was particularly important, they had it copied and then sent it to 10 or 20 people that this person thought might be interested in it. So here are some of these people who got famous for that. These first two were in England, also both born in Germany for some reason, Samuel Hartlib and Henry Oldenburg. In France, I think the big player in this is a friar called Marin Mersenne. In the Netherlands, Isaac Beekman. But these people essentially were famous for being great correspondents. But the truth is that everybody who was a member of the Republic of Letters wrote letters. It's not why it's called Republic of Letters, but that is the way it worked. Now, the printing press does play a role in it, also not quite as big as Elizabeth Eisenstein supposes. But it's clear that certainly as we move on in time, that books and pamphlets play an ever larger role, and that by the middle of the 17th century, something like refereed journals are coming around, like the Transactions of the Royal Society and the Journal des Savants in France and things like that. So clearly printing press and cheaper paper, as well as lower transportation costs, were technological inputs for this emergence of this institution, but it comes to its full bloom only in the Age of Enlightenment. The other elements that explain the Age of Enlightenment are a little bit more harder to demonstrate, but I think clearly the heritage of a lingua franca does help. Everybody, certainly for the first century and a half, everybody wrote in Latin, although when people start switching to the vernacular, this doesn't seem to stop these guys at all. There is a set of traditions, probably more imagined than real, of some kind of intellectual unity that harks back to the classical world and to the medieval church. And perhaps more important is that, and I'll come back to that, is that Europe is full of these sort of semi-autonomous organizations, or corporations as they were called, in which this Republic of Letters could thrive. So you think about self-governing cities that may have been formerly part of some kind of empire, but in fact basically did whatever they wanted. This Republic of Letters is largely an urban phenomenon. Universities, of course, which still were to a large extent autonomous, and of course later academies and scientific societies, so some of these came under direct control of the governments. But at the same time, you have these informal places where people meet, Parisian salons, which some people think is all that matters, and these British coffee houses and inns, things like that. So all of these organizations basically were run privately or semi-privately. And so here is one sort of thing that I think we should cover, and that is this Republic of Letters is the institution that sets the rules by which the market for ideas would operate. So what are these rules? Well, first, it's an open community. Anyone, essentially, within reason, could enter. Well, within reason, obviously, that exclude 90% of the population. That's not. But you didn't have to have a heritage of nobility or money or anything like that. Many of the big players were people coming from the medium bourgeoisie, like Descartes, or impoverished gentry like Newton, and so on and so forth. Secondly, and this takes me back to the sort of point that Paul David makes, knowledge and data should be open and shared. And so people, when you discovered something, the sort of medieval secrecy by which knowledge was often kept is essentially gone by the end of the period, as William Amen points out. You share your data. And of course, you can learn this what happens when somebody doesn't. Okay, so John Flamsteed, the astronomer royal, refused to share his data with Newton, and this created a big upheaval, and eventually Newton, who was sort of the very powerful guy you didn't want to cross, had his data taken, but that's a different story. It was in principle at least egalitarian and meritocratic and non-hierarchical. So the fact that you were a count or a lord didn't matter for much. Also, of course, if you were really, really good, like in any intellectual community, and people looked up to you, and Newton probably became something of an idol. And maybe it's arguable that even after all said and done, wealth and birth may have counted for more than they like to admit, but clearly it wasn't the main criteria. Property rights, as they are today, are not defined in any kind of exclusionary right, but quite the contrary. Okay? You don't exclude people. You want them to acknowledge your priority. And so we're talking about credit rather than profit. But credit meaning here, basically, you are associated with a particular idea. And it's not surprising that in this age, we see priority fights. Some of them, of course, we've all heard of, like the famous fight about who invented calculus between Leibniz and Newton. Some of them more obscure, like the two Dutchmen, Reinier van der Graaf and Jan Swammerdam, who fought over who had discovered the sex organs of female insects. And it was so severe, one of them actually died out of pure chagrin because he claimed the other guy had stolen his ideas. So you think about this. But priority fights become common, and have been well documented by Merton and many others. Most important, perhaps, or at least I think most important, is that all knowledge, old and new, is contestable. The motto of the Royal Society, when it's founded in 1660, is in nullius verba, right? On no one's word. So there are no sacred cows. Anything can be questioned. That includes, by the way, the writings of Isaac Newton, despite the fact that he became something of an idol. And so all new propositions, and if you want, all old propositions, are to be checked, tested, reproduced, evaluated. And of course, what that means is that because you know that insiders have been checking knowledge, and if nobody refutes it, then you sort of have, as an outsider, have more a tendency to trust this data. So we all, anybody who's ever dealt with the, peer refereeing process knows that it is not a perfect process, but it's probably better than nothing. And so for outsiders, knowing that a paper was peer reviewed, or at least not peer attacked and demolished, means something. And finally, and this is critical, this is a transnational community. It is widely spread over a large chunk of Western Europe, and it's sort of unaffected by military and religious dispute. When I say sort of course, because this is more theory than practice. From time to time it was, but Lavoisier is famously put it, the sciences are never at war. That's not quite true, but it's still true that a lot of people were willing to bridge political and religious differences and communicate with people in other parts of Europe. Now, what accounts for the success of the Republic of Letters is that it was to a large extent independent of other institutions, such as political and religious ones. Now, I say to some extent because they're always, not completely independent, but even in France, where the state probably meddled more than anywhere else, than elsewhere, this was probably true. And this was largely the case because in Europe, unlike most other places in the world, people took advantage of the political fragmentation by limiting rulers and religions from controlling knowledge creation. In the sense that if they prohibited the publication of your book, you would publish it somewhere else. And if they threatened you in person, you could pack up your bags and leave. And in fact, a lot of European intellectuals did that. Never forget that Hobbes wrote Leviathan in Paris, that Locke wrote the essay on toleration in Amsterdam, but that even the Netherlands was not this haven for a liberal always, at least, because as every Dutch schoolgirl knows, the great Dutch jurist Hugo Grotius, or Hugo de Groot as he's known in the Dutch, was smuggled out in a bookcase from Loevestein. Am I got it right? I got this right. The Loevestein Castle, and spent the rest of his career in Paris because he was persona non grata in the Netherlands. Now, what is important, not only that people could do this, but this was common knowledge. Everybody knew that people could do this. And that actually turns out to be rather important. So here's one example of a guy who was really magnificent at using the European state system and playing one power or another. This is a man called Tommaso Campanella. These are his dates. And so he was a friar, but, he was a troublemaker, okay? And he was, in many ways, a thorn in the side of the Spanish rulers. And so he spent, for being a troublemaker, 27 years in a Neapolitan jail, which would make you think I'm wrong. Here's a guy who was a heretic and put in jail. Except that while he was in jail, he was formally announced that he was under the protection of Emperor Rudolf II, who was the sort of other branch of the Habsburg, who was still ruling what later became Austria, and was in Prague actually at the time. And basically Rudolf said, you put this guy in jail, okay, but you treat him nicely. Well, we don't know exactly what his conditions were in jail, but he wrote 7 books in there, which means he must have at least access to pen and paper and probably a scribe. And one of the books is his famous City in the Sun, which is kind of a utopian tract, but he also wrote a pamphlet in it defending Galileo. And so, obviously, the degree of suppression here was at best very partial. And this is fairly early on. This is still before the famous Galileo trial. So this battle isn't over. But clearly you can sort of see how people were using the fragmentation system to manipulate one state after another. By the way, when he was let out of jail, he went to France, where they never miss an opportunity to stick their finger in the eyes of the Habsburg. So they celebrated him and made him sort of a big star. So clearly a good example of people who did this. So I'm not the first to discover this. Okay, here's a quote from David Hume, who could sort of look back at this, and basically he said what I just said. He said, nothing is more favorable to the rise of politeness and learning than a number of neighboring and independent states connected together by commerce and policy. But I say politeness, he really means something much, broader and wider than just basically good institutions. And so the emulation, which is what he means by what we use competition, is an obvious source of improvement, and blah 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 blah. So the divisions into small states are favorable to learning by stopping the progress of authority as well as that of power. So this is a very much an Enlightenment sort of idea. And so what I would argue, therefore, is that political fragmentation is both critical in supporting the positive and the negative incentives in this market for ideas. The positive incentives, and I'll come back to that, is it creates incentives through competitions on the demand side among this patronage system that I'll pick up in a minute. But what, of course, matters is that fragmentation essentially is the phenomenon that weakens the negative incentives, because people could move, and because every state in Europe had its reactionary element, but they could never coordinate. They could never get their act together. So there was always some place in Europe that you could go, even if this involved obviously a fair amount of cost. So Jan Comenius, or Komensky, the great Czech reformer and intellectual and so on, moved scores of times in his life. He started off in Moravia, and then he went to Poland, he went to Sweden, he went to England, then he went to Holland, then he went back to England. I mean, he moved around because every time people decided he was a troublemaker, but he always found some place to go. I think he was either in 1636 offered to be the first president of Harvard, which he wisely declined. But that is the kind of mobility that you see happening among intellectuals, and that's the kind of thing I'm talking about. Now, on the demand side, we have what I call competitive patronage. And that is that you get patronage, and this is sort of the gist of Paul's paper. You get patronage because you establish a reputation among your peers through your scholarly writing. And in fact, I hate to say it, but we still live with that system. I mean, we don't call it patronage, but that's what a tenured professorship is. And so you get it on the basis of your reputation among your peers. That's how it works. Now, in those days, of course, patronage was more than just university positions, although there were those. But they were mostly court appointments and things like that. And out of that, of course, what emerges is open science, because you want to publish, because you want to impress your peers, because that's how you gain the reputation, and that's how you gain the patronage. I should say, by the way, that reputation, of course, isn't just about patronage. Not everybody who wanted to build a reputation wanted patronage. We know of some cases in which this could not have been possibly consideration. Robert Boyle, the great English scientist, for instance, he didn't need patronage. He gave out patronage. He was the second or the third richest man of England, so he obviously needed patronage. Anthony van Leeuwenhoek, the Delft microscopist, did a huge amount of work to establish his reputation, sent all these papers to England and so on. But it's not clear he ever gained anything from it. He was a well-to-do, not terribly rich trader, and that it was kind of a hobby, but he cared very much about his reputation. So clearly reputation matters in and of itself. But clearly the mechanism of patronage and the sort of letter writing part of this network are very closely related. And here's a nice contemporary illustration of that. D'Alembert, who was obviously one of the most prominent citizens of the Republic of Letters in the 18th century, writes in 1745, nothing helps to establish the reputation of a man of letters than un grand commerce épistolaire. That's basically a lot of letters being written. And of course, if you have a high reputation, you're going to get lots of letters, and if you respond to them, you strengthen your. Now, patronage is a competitive market, and I think that is what's sort of underlying all this. Okay, so people who have high reputations do get better jobs, and no better example, and probably everybody in the room knows this about Galileo. When he publishes his famous book, and he's a fairly poorly paid professor of mathematics in Padua, and then when the book comes out and he becomes all of a sudden a superstar, so to speak, his phone rings, not quite, but you know what I mean. And it's the Grand Duke of Florence who says, well, how would you like a job as court scientist for 4 times the salary and no teaching? Well, guess what? He took the job. That's what reputation does for you. Now, on the demand side here, things are tricky, because why would these courts want these people? And I think there is a whole bunch of reasons there. Some of them have been written about by Biagioli and Westphal and others. But essentially, some of that is just basically demonstration effect, ostentation, if you want. You wanted to, have the best and most famous scientists on your court, just as you wanted to have the best musicians, the best composers, the best painters, the best astrologers, blah, 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 blah. So guys like Rudolph II, Louis XIV, and the Medicis in Florence, that's what they wanted. So this is basically a signaling game. But there were other things that these people did for you, and many of them were doctors, and they were getting what they thought was the best medical advice of the time, which it may not have been terribly good, but better, that's what they thought. Tutoring for their children was another thing. So poor René Descartes was hauled off to Stockholm, where he had to tutor the children of the Queen Christina, and of course eventually that killed him because he got pneumonia early in the morning, and But this is what these guys did. Some of them were just there to essentially because they were smart people, and the ruler thought somewhat mistakenly that if somebody was really smart as a mathematician, as a philosopher, he also would give political advice. So the King of Hanover experienced that when he hired Leibniz, who was admittedly extremely smart, but a terrible politician. He gave very bad advice, but that's what they did. But I think the most important thing is not only that these people were competing for the best minds, but everybody knew that they were in a competitive market. And that really means that even if you are king and you have this guy sitting at your court, you cannot tell him, think this way, think my way, because if you forced him to think your way, he'd just leave if he was good enough. And everybody knows this. And so, the reason I like, and I'm coming to the end of this, but the reason I like the concept of a competitive market is because an economist who studies market realizes that a market is not a place that is either conflictual or harmonious, but in some sense combines the two, right? On the one hand, this is a world that's full of conflict. These guys, many of these people just detested each other. You read the letters, it's just horrible. It's jealousy, it's personal animosities, it's grudges, it's, accusations, many of them, fairly well grounded, of plagiarism, of intellectual theft, and so on. It's pretty bad stuff. At the same time, however, the game people did play, roughly speaking, by the rules. And they followed these rules. And that's what makes this whole institution click. Now, just to sum up, the Republic of Letters is so significant because, what it of course means, because it's transnational, your constituency is not just the people in your town, it's all of Europe. If you publish a good book in Amsterdam, within, say, a year, 18 months, it's read in Krakow, in Edinburgh, in Madrid, in Naples. And a little bit of luck, in Stockholm, and places like that. So, in some sense, it means that for each intellectual, their constituencies weren't large, but they're much larger than they would have been if this multinational organization had not existed. So Europe gets the best of all possible worlds. They get political fragmentation, which was all the advantages that I talked about, plus intellectual unification, which has basically these economies of scale. It's diverse and pluralistic, but it's still integrated in that sense. And so, as I said, demonstrably superior ideas eventually get to rule. So, just to come back to briefly, why do I stress these biases and this cultural revolution stuff because it's about how people change their mind. It's about how people are persuaded, and much of the book is just about that. Now, most of the important for this, of course, is the victory of this Baconian program. And that's why Bacon plays such a big role in my book. Also, arguably, he just distilled what already was in the air before that. But in fact, in many ways, that's actually what entrepreneurs do. And so what people like Margaret Jacob and Paul Slack in a recent book have argued is that this leads to something called an industrial culture. Now, Jacob and Slack have argued this for England, but that's Anglo-centric. In fact, the same thing happens to a great degree throughout Europe. It weakens as you go from west to east, and maybe from north to south, but a large chunk of Western Europe, precisely the same area where the Industrial Revolution takes place, is there. So let me just summarize it, and I've been going on too long. The most important institutional change that explains the Industrial Revolution is not better property rights or a decline in transaction costs, or, in all due respect to my friends Jim Robinson and Steve Pinkus, 1688 and the Glorious Revolution. Instead, it is the one institution that governs the accumulation and diffusion of useful knowledge and intellectual innovations. And the most important outcome of that is the Enlightenment and everything the Enlightenment entailed. And so now comes the big question, so what? And this is not a trivial question, because it's not so obvious that the growth of science in the so-called scientific revolution, say period 1550 or 1700, say starting with, roughly speaking, Copernicus, ending with Newton if you want, roughly speaking, how much that contributed to the Industrial Revolution, because the Industrial Revolution was mostly about gizmos that were largely independent of science, or as Cardwell once wrote, nothing about these machinery that in the cotton industry, for instance, would have surprised Archimedes. So the notion that Galileo and Newton and Huygens and all these people were necessary for the Industrial Revolution has been contested, and probably rightly so. I think that takes a very narrow view of what the Industrial Revolution was all about. The issue is really much deeper than how much science do you need to build a spinning jenny. And that is because without the Republic of Leather, the Industrial Revolution may still have taken place sort of in the sort of cotton industry and a few other industries we see. But basically, my sense would have been after 1815 or 1820, it would have fizzled out. It would have become another one of Goldstone's efflorescences. We have, after all, in Europe seen these technological outbursts, and then after a few decades, it sort of settled down, and all right, so we now have firearms and printing presses, and that's it basically. But the Industrial Revolution wasn't like that. This time it was different. Instead of settling down on a set of dominant designs that were, say, around by 1815, say, low pressure, what type of engines, and spinning jennies, and maybe advanced, maybe power looms if you want, and a few other things. But it basically that could have been the end of it. But it wasn't. Okay? And it's the ever-growing infusion of science after 1815, after 1820, that makes the difference. But that science doesn't just come from heaven. That scientific revolution is, in fact, 2 centuries in the making. Thank you. All right. Questions? I'm going to take, well, no, other people's questions. Yeah. Avner, I figured, yeah. You need a microphone.
Yep.
Just to break the ice, you said that basically the Industrial Revolution, without the Enlightenment, the Industrial Enlightenment, there wouldn't have been the continuation of the Industrial Revolution, right? The question might be asked the opposite. Was the Industrial Revolution necessary for the Enlightenment industrialism or Industrial Revolution to transpire? Namely, could a scientific revolution in itself transform society and the foundation of technology and make it scientifically based, even if there wouldn't have been the steam engine when and where it was?
I'm trying to think what you mean by the question exactly, Avner. I mean, I would think the industrial, you can see signs of the Industrial Enlightenment happening from the beginning of the, say, 18th century. Between 1700 and 1750, there's a whole sort of attempt to improve, to solve certain technological problems, many of which are quite difficult. And so it takes a long time, and most of them don't break through. But the notion that we can make material life in our society better by solving technical problems, that stuff is in the air. And a good example, we have certain well-defined problems that we're trying to solve. How to measure longitude at sea, how to fight smallpox. For most inventions, yes.
But for the continuation, this was important.
Absolutely.
So I'm saying, suppose there wouldn't have been the Industrial Revolution, but there would have been the Scientific Revolution. Would you have taken more or less the same? You would have stick the steam engine and gone to the combustion engine.
It's possible. It's possible. I would phrase the question somewhat differently. Okay, so you may recall I have a long paragraph about this in my book on the Industrial Revolution, and I asked the counterfactual. Suppose England had not existed, or Britain, I should say, because suppose the Spanish Armada had been successful, and Britain would have been overrun by these retrograde Jesuit priests who nipped every innovation in the bud. Would there have been an Industrial Revolution? Now, if that's the only thing you're taking away, so there would have been. So if we agree that the Industrial Revolution happened in the British Midlands mostly, okay, what would have happened? And I argued there that we would have seen an Industrial Revolution. It would have been more linen and less cotton. Perhaps far more water power, less steam power. Probably less, a few other things that we can think of. But it would have happened in France, it would have been in Belgium, it would have been in Switzerland. Now, if you expand the counterfactual and say, well, these retrograde Jesuit priests had run all over Europe, then I'm not so sure. But then you wouldn't have a scientific revolution either, because in fact, the Catholic reaction didn't suppress everything, but they suppressed a lot. They wouldn't ever accept, for a long time, accept the Copernican revolution. But for instance, I don't know there's a wonderful book that came out last summer by Amir Alexander about infinitesimals. And basically, the Jesuits decided that, infinitesimal mathematics and calculus were ungodly. Don't ask me why, I'm not a Jesuit. But so they never taught it. They were good mathematicians, but they wouldn't teach the frontier of mathematics, okay? And so on and on and on. So if all of Europe had fallen under a coordinating power that was essentially anti-modernist, and then, it might not have happened. That's what I said. This is contingent. The Dutch revolt succeeded, the Armada failed, and the fragmentation in Europe remained very much part of reality. But I can think of alternatives. But once the scientific revolution is on, once these guys have written and essentially junked much of what people thought they knew, my sense is that it's terribly unlikely that this would not have happened elsewhere, even if there had been no Industrial Revolution. Yeah. So Britain, to give the analogy, so what is the role of Britain in British Industrial Revolution in the subsequent process of economic growth? There's two ways. So the way British historians have always depicted is Britain was the locomotive. They schlepped the other wagons behind it, but they were the source of energy. And I've annoyed a lot of people in Britain by making the simile of an electrical train. So the first car is there, but it's not the source of power. The source of power comes from some power above it, right? And that is the European Enlightenment. That is the electrical force. And the fact that they were first is almost accidental. Now, when I say almost accidental, I'm obviously abstracting from a lot, and I've written about why Britain is first. There's a good story, I'm not going to tell it here, but that is clearly important. But it is not a British phenomenon. It is a European phenomenon. Other European nations were later, and for good reasons, political upheaval and, guilds and lots of things. But it could have been the Dutch and it wasn't the Dutch, and it could have been the French and it wasn't the French. But they all had this potential because they were part of this Enlightenment. They were influenced by this spirit of improvement and progress, and they all believed that they could make life better by solving real scientific problems. And that was not a British monopoly, to the contrary, in fact. Yes? Yes, Andrea.
Thanks, Joel, for this wonderful talk. So you have mentioned that an important cause of emergence of this common market for ideas between the 15 and 1700 is political fragmentation.
Yes.
So then I wonder what are the causes of political fragmentation to the extent that geography is maybe an important cause. Should we then think that at the end of the day, geography is the fundamental cause of all, that is, of the scientific revolution, of the industrial revolution, so on and so forth?
Well, I know that's what Ian Morris believes, so I can put it this way. So I don't engage that question in my book. There's a new book coming out by Philip Hoffman that is called The Sources of European. So, sort of it's not out yet. It's coming out in my Princeton series, in which he spends a lot of time talking about it. And Phil actually, you should read it. I mean, I'm not here to, but Phil basically rejects the geographical hypothesis that Europe was fragmented and comes up with a bunch of other explanations. I don't think at the moment we know, but if Europe remained fragmented, it's not for lack of trying, right? I mean, there were rulers throughout who actually tried to put it together, some more successful than others, Charlemagne and Charles V and Louis XIV and Hitler. I mean, there were people who tried to do this, and nobody succeeds. So you can take this back all the way to the 5th century and look at the differences in languages and so on. I don't really know the answer. I'm not even sure that I'm 100% believe Phil's rejection of fragmentation. But I want to add something about fragmentation, which is important, which is, if you look at the map of Europe, say anno 1600, it looks fragmented, but in fact it's much worse than that. Okay, it's much more fragmented than it seems, because even countries that look like they're not fragmented are fragmented. I'll give you one example, which is my former colleague Regina Grafe wrote a magnificent book about Spain. Spain is always cited as this sort of one example of a unified nation state. Forget it. I mean, Spain is highly decentralized. She actually argues that Spain wasn't much more centralized than Germany was, and she should know since she's German and works in Spain, so she has a good position to compare it to. Spain is a mess. Every region has a great deal of autonomy, huge amount of privileges. King can't touch it. But it's even worse than that, because not only that different regions in places like Spain and France and so on have a great deal of autonomy, but within each region there are these autonomous organizations, these corporations that Avner writes about. Okay, so within the same unit, the amount of political power is highly decentralized. Nobody controls, really no political authority can control the intellectual market. And it's not for lack of trying, there are a lot of them try, but they can't do it because there is so much fragmentation. And it's, the other thing is, it's worth pointing out, is that you have not only political fragmentation, but also religious fragmentation. The competition between religions is actually, I didn't talk about this here, but it's not just competition between states, competition between religions, because as the Reformation arises or proceeds, one of the areas in which they compete is education. So Lawrence Stone has a classic article about that came out in '69, which he points out that the competition between the Church of England and the so-called dissenters actually raised the educational level for both, because the dissenters put up these dissenting academies, which were good schools because they couldn't go to Anglican schools. But then the Anglicans saw these were better schools. They started to send their kids to these dissenting academies, so their schools got better. And then you think about the Jesuits and their educational, and I've bad-mouthed them this afternoon, I would typically do, but they were, in terms of education, they were a major force. Now, why were they doing this? Not because they thought investing in human capital would have a high rate of return. No, they want these people from going bad to going to the other side. And so competition between religion actually encourages human capital, and it may have even encouraged at some level scientific research, although that gets to be a more difficult issue. Yes, Sumitra.
I'm curious, I mean, a lot of what you were talking about seems to be related to this concept of humanism, right? So, but humanism sort of, is commonly associated with the Renaissance, which, so in the period just before the period you're discussing rather than this period. Is it, how much of what you're discussing actually emerged then rather than a little later?
I don't think the word humanism appears in my book, by the way. I'm not sure why it should, but maybe I should. But I am not sure about the Renaissance. The Renaissance is a process of rediscovery, right? They discover all these ancient books, some of which they, retranslate from, some they find in libraries. They discover all this corpus of learning, and they study it, and they, some of it they get it, they do strange things with it, but never mind. But what I'm interested in is not the rediscovery. My interest is that after they rediscover it, I say, you know what? Is this right? Is Ptolemy right? Is Hipparchus right? Is Aristotle right? That's the big question. Is Aristotle right? And slowly but certainly, they start to question these things. And that's a huge step. We're going to talk about that more tomorrow, but it's not enough to rediscover the classics. It's that's a big step, because in the year 1000 they had almost none of that, and by 1500 they do. But it's not enough. It's not like we are restudying the classics and look how wise these people are. At some point they take a step back and say, is this right? Can we test this? Does this conform with what we know about the world? And then they start asking questions, and they start testing, and they end up rejecting a great deal of stuff, and that's not Renaissance. So here's one example. There's a French philosopher called Petrus Ramus, or Pierre de la Ramée, who died in 1572 in a bad way, called St. Bartholomew's Night. But Pierre de la Ramée was promoted on a dissertation whose title, roughly translated, is "Everything Aristotle Taught is Wrong." So you go, this, a century earlier, he would have been strung up for that. Well, eventually he was killed, but I don't think they knew who he was when they killed him. But that's not Renaissance, okay? That's taking it a step further. That's questioning. That's repudiation to some extent. And so it's not the rediscovery of the classical learnings, it is repudiation. That, I think, is a huge, huge step. It happens at every level. People come up with new ideas. Say, look, Aristotle said this and that, but I have a test. I have a phenomenon. Here's, now I have to get me going on this. Tycho Brahe, the great astronomer. So Aristotle taught that these fixed stars in the sky are there forever, and nothing ever changes. So you got these planets to move around, and everything is fixed. And then one day, Tycho Brahe documents supernova. So the star that wasn't there before, now is there. And so Aristotle said this could not happen. And so he says, look, I'm sorry, I tested it. What Aristotle said isn't right. So he was more polite than Ramus, I must say. But that is the kind of thing that happens over and over and over again. It happens in astronomy, it happens in botany, it happens in medicine, it happens everywhere. So people take the corpus, the classics that they had rediscovered, and basically they say, look, these guys are full of it. This is wrong. Now, this is a huge step for every civilization to take. And this is sort of the central part of the book, which I haven't talked about. But it is critical, because it can only happen in a competitive market, because the vested interest in guys who teach this stuff is huge. In 1580, in Oxford, a Don who taught anything that contradicted Aristotle's teaching would be fined 5 shillings. That's reported by Giordano Bruno, who was visiting, he was himself a troublemaker, but he was visiting Oxford at the time, and he said, look, they're fining people for teaching things that contradicted to Aristotle. Now this is obviously a rearguard action. 20 years later, everybody is basically abandoning this stuff. But you know, there's a huge amount of tenacity in the resistance of the conventional wisdom. And overcoming that is not a foregone conclusion. These guys could have won. The reason they couldn't win is because if they resisted in one place, the innovators would simply go somewhere else. And coordinating this is impossible. Yes? Oh, God. One more question. This gentleman had his hand up for a long time, and I don't mean...
Well, thank you for the fascinating talk, and it raises a lot of questions. I'm a historian of China, so I'm kind of being a little bit impatient, maybe pushing the talk to tomorrow a little bit more here. So my question would be, why in the beginning, like these people all of a sudden, like the best minds of Europe start to be interested in science? They're creating Republic of Letters for science. In comparison, in China, there were a lot of like these intellectual circles over centuries, but all these circles, they competed in poetry, for instance. So here the question is why science become the focus of this attention instead of the, like the Renaissance, like people talk about arts and humanities.
But I am not sure that your premise is correct. I mean, I don't talk about this because I'm not an expert on this, but I can tell you that between 1500 and 1700, there are revolutions in Europe in painting that are almost as dramatic as the ones that are in science. And I can tell you from a bit more knowledge that the same is true for music. You know, the music written in 1500, the music in 1700 is irrecognizably different. People start new schools of music, and the music, you know, in 1700 is so. In architecture, I mean, in lots of areas, there are radical changes. People innovate, and they all, you know, what is true for science is true for painting as well. You know, the best painters in Europe were courted by the most powerful kings. And so if you're Anthony van Dyck or, you know, Peter Rubens, you know, people bid for your services, and they clearly, and that is what's happening throughout. So Louis XIV doesn't just want Cassini and Huygens and people like that at his court. He also wants Jean-Baptiste Lully for the same reasons. And of course that encourages music to be innovative. And so, you know, people like Georg Friedrich Handel, he was in some ways the equivalent of a citizen of the Republic of Letters, except there's no such thing as the Republic of Music, but maybe that'll be my next book, I don't know. But you see what I'm saying? These guys moved about just as much as the science, except that as a musician, you are less likely to be in trouble for heresy and apostasy and black magic the way these guys were, but it still works very much the same way. So I'm not sure it's just in science and technology. In fact, it's across the board. But it's all the result, I think, of this competitive system that takes over. So I actually, now, I'm not going to say anything about China today, if you don't mind, otherwise, because that'll be tomorrow. Okay, thank you.